Women's Soccer Review Podcast with Duane Rollins and Jonathan Tannenwald on the Sports Podcasting Network.
Welcome to the latest episode of the Women's Soccer Review here on the Sports Podcasting Network. I'm Jonathan Tannenwald of the Philadelphia Inquirer, at home on the line with Duane Rollins in Toronto, our producer Kevin Laramie in Montreal, and from New York, Kelsey Trainor of the Equalizer returns to join us. When we last had her on, I did not know that she and I had a common acquaintance and a common affinity for a certain bagel place down the street from me. I'm not going to name them. If they want to sponsor us, they're more than welcome to if they're listening to the show. But if they were to do so, Kevin might cut the line because he's a Montreal bagel guy and he's the producer. And I'm the New York bagel guy, and I'm the host. Kelsey, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to talk about the U.S. women's national team losing in court on its equal pay suit against U.S. Soccer. We're recording this on Sunday morning. I'm sure that by now, whenever it is that you're listening to this, you will have heard the news. We're going to get into some of the analysis. And I'm going to disclaim here right at the top that I might get angry on this show. Kelsey might get angry on this show. Duane might get angry on this show. I'm sure all of you are angry already. It happens. But a lot of what we're going to talk about on this show, as much as I'm not going to enjoy it, is why the U.S. women's players lost and some signs that they were, as we've said on this show and elsewhere, some signs that they were going to lose and possibly some mistakes that their legal team made along the way. And I've got a bunch of, obviously, excerpts and things. Kelsey already wrote for EqualizerSoccer.com on this. Meg Linehan wrote for The Athletic. Steve Bank, who's a professor at UCLA's law school, said some really smart things about all of this. And so, Kelsey, I think I will start here reading a couple of excerpts from the ruling itself. Quote, it appears that the women's national team did not make more money than the men solely because they played more games. Rather, the women both played more games and made more money than the men per game. Then later, merely comparing what women's players received under their own CBA with what they would have received under the men's CBA discounts the value that the team placed on the guaranteed benefits they receive under their agreement, which they opted for. And then lastly, for this question, the statements offered by the plaintiffs, which are the women's players, are insufficient to establish a genuine dispute that women's national team players are paid at a rate less than the rate paid to men's national team players. And I look at this and I think to myself, Judge Klausner may well not be a soccer fan. He might not know much about the sport. And if you are coming to this as a total outsider and you look only at the numbers that were provided, without any, or at least without enough, substantial evidence of deliberate bias on the part of the power brokers at U.S. Soccer, this is where you end up.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back into this court cases, you know, the numbers from 2015 to 2019 is really all that's at stake in this case. And, you know, legally all along, you kind of knew that this was a very real possibility. The exact reasoning that the judge gave here, and the fact that he said you cannot compare these two collective bargaining agreements is something that, you know, legal minds and the players and the federation knew was a very real possibility of being the end result all along.
It seems to me, and, you know, you've been very closely following this, and as have I, and I know the players and some of the lawyers and the people at U.S. Soccer and so on. There was a dispute in the case about whether and how the women's players tried to get or were offered or tried or themselves offered or whatnot, getting out of the central contract system to a compensation system equivalent to the men, which is paid by the game instead of U.S. Soccer paying the annual salaries of the women's players. And Meg Linehan made this point very eloquently on Twitter, which is that the reason why these central contracts exist is because the women's players could not achieve fair compensation, or certainly anywhere close to their market value, but at least fair salaries solely from club teams. So U.S. Soccer paid them so that they would be able to make a living. And that's been the case for many, many years.
Yeah, and I think that, too, if you look at the position that they were in to negotiate or to get this contract, they could not have gotten what the men got in terms of the bang for their buck, the value for what they were worth. And I think Jane McManus equated it to the Scottie Pippen scenario, right? Like, he was worth this much money, but he couldn't necessarily in his contract negotiations get that at that point. And so, he had to take what he got and stay with what he had. And then, a few years down the line, he ended up getting it. But I think that's kind of where we're at right now with the U.S. women's national team.
I want to follow up real quick, and Duane will take the question after this. A couple of months ago, Bo Durr of Soccer America, and before he wrote for Soccer America, for folks who don't know, he was USA Today's soccer beat writer for many, many years, who's been around everybody involved in this for a long time. Bo said something that he got blasted to the moon for by women's soccer Twitter, and I understand why. Because he didn't say it very eloquently, and he didn't say it as completely as I think he should have. But part of the point is, if the women's players are saying, we are trying to do something here for future years. And this is a little more, I admit, Kelsey, of a soccer question than a legal question.
Yeah.
You're free to answer it however you want.
Okay.
Women have said here, we're trying to do something for future years, while at the same time trying to get as much money as they possibly can. And the central contracts might be a blocker here to a long-term sustainable something in terms of the future years category. That was the point that Bo tried to make, and he got blasted to the moon, because what he didn't say is it's perfectly fine for the players to try to get as much money as they possibly can. That's not a problem. If he'd said that out loud,
right,
he might not have gotten blasted to the moon. He might have gotten blasted to China, but not to the moon. If the U.S. women were to have gotten $67 million from the judge, if they would have won full straight out the whole shooting match, it may well have blown a hole in U.S. soccer's budget so big that they would have had to ransack the budgets of the youth national team programs in order to help pay it, which would have obviously dramatically affected the future years. I don't have a problem with the women going out and getting as much money as they possibly can, but for such time as the central contract, I think the central contract system is a very big part of this, and I think that the going out to get as much money as they possibly can, again, it's not a bad thing, but it might actually be a little bit of a problem here in terms of a legal perspective. What do you think?
Stuff like this happens a lot in the legal world, where you get this big verdict, and at the end of the day, realistically, what would work between the two parties, because they have to continue working together, is that, say the judge or the jury issues a $67 million verdict. These two sides can still come together after the fact and change that, right? They can say, we're going to change our contracts going forward. We're going to essentially settle the case after it's already been settled. Because, the players on one hand would realize that kind of what you're talking about is that this could deplete a system. And U.S. Soccer would realize, like, hey, we're actually legally obligated to pay this amount, but let's figure out a way moving forward that both sides can agree to. So it would give the players this leverage, because at the end of the day, they'd have a judgment that would be in their favor in terms of negotiating anything going forward. So that's something I think that could have been dealt with had they won that amount of money. But as of right now, we don't have that scenario. And, I don't anticipate that, even on appeal, if it gets appealed and if they win, I don't anticipate that, that 67 million will be, a number going forward.
I was talking to one of my legal contacts this weekend, and they referred to this summary judgment as basically a death sentence to any future courtroom solutions to this, is how they put it. I'm wondering if you could sort of tell our listeners what an appeal process might look like from here, sort of go through the nuts and bolts of that, and what the possibility, in your opinion, there is of any kind of successful appeal of this decision.
Yeah, so I mean, at the end of the day, this is not a final order because there's still this Title VII claim left as the case. So they can't appeal this technically right now. They have to wait until the trial is done, or they have to wait till the trial is done and the result, and then they can appeal everything. Or they can request interlocutory appeal, which is basically asking the court for permission to appeal it right now. That's a really tough thing to get done, and I don't anticipate that the court would grant permission in this case. In terms of kind of what this summary judgment does for the future, it is setting a law. It's setting a case precedent that's saying that, you can't compare two contracts of this kind. If they're so different, you can't compare them under the law. It is really deciding law for future cases like this, like your contact had said. And that's another big issue that I think people in the legal community have, is that I don't think anybody saw this coming down on summary judgment. I think people anticipated that this might be the end result and maybe it might be the end reading. But the fact that it came down on summary judgment, which is such a high standard, and it basically establishes law on the case and for cases going forward, is really, really interesting. And that in and of itself might be the way that it gets appealed. Basically, an appellate court saying, you might be right, but you should have never decided this on summary judgment. It's not appropriate.
A lot of people are obviously very angry about this. You've seen a lot of support in the hours since this has come out. Joe Biden, the Democratic nominee, has a presumptive Democratic nominee, I should say, has kind of stated that he might withhold World Cup funding if he is elected. Obviously, putting the politics of that statement aside, it does indicate that there is a great deal of public support still for the women. How much, in your mind, has their bargaining position been damaged by this judgment in the days ahead if U.S. Soccer still wants to get back and find a solution to negotiate to get this out of the legal system?
I mean, their position, their bargaining power has clearly gone down. I don't know that it's as much as people, are anticipating, because at the end of the day, these parties have to, theoretically have to work together for years and years to come. So there needs to be a trust that is start to kind of building back between the two. And, as much as U.S. Soccer, it is a win for them legally, they need to fix their reputation with soccer fans, with the players, and clearly, obviously with the, presidential hopefuls as well. So, I think that both sides are actually really incentivized by this result to get something done that is meaningful. I think Julie Foudy's always talking about it. It's like both sides need to sit down at the table and actually have real conversations. And, from my understanding from both sides, is that just has not happened. So I think this is kind of the incentive for both sides to get that done.
You mentioned the appeal process, and I want to go to a specific point in the judge's ruling that could be a very big factor in the player's ability to appeal. And this is from a tweet from Steve Bank out at UCLA, who went through this ruling and translated a lot of it into plain English. According to the court, the women's players did not introduce evidence to dispute U.S. Soccer's calculations about rates of pay per game, for which the women were higher over the 4-year period. As such, when the judge determined that U.S. Soccer's calculations were a material fact and there was no dispute over it, that sounds to me like either a mistake by the lawyers or an admission by the lawyers. What do you think?
It's interesting, and I'd have to go back and look at all of the expert reports and all of the opinions proffered in them, because there was a lot and they were very long. But I don't know that I could say for certain that the players did not dispute that. I mean, clearly the judge says that. So as of right now, that's where it stands. But if I'm the players, I'm going to point to something in my expert reports that disputes that. And then I'm going to say there is a genuine issue of material fact for trial, and the judge got it wrong by saying that. I can't say for certain. I can't give an opinion to that because I'd have to go back through the expert reports and read through them. But that's where, in terms of the appeal process, that's kind of the next route that I would go.
I have a sound effect. I can't call it a prop because it's the radio, so I'll call it a sound effect. It's this morning's New York Times. And it talks about, fair resolutions and so on. And the kicker at the end is privately, parties on both sides have long agreed that a negotiated peace for U.S. soccer. It's a negotiated peace is the best way out for U.S. soccer and its women's team. There's a lot of things, there's a lot of pieces in this. Turf, which the women, here, just drop something. So, there we go. That's really a sound effect, isn't it? Money, the turf, which the women raise, we can get into that because that is a huge example, I think, of the court of public opinion versus the court of law being different. But I look at all these pieces that are involved in this, and the attempt by the women's team to paint a broad picture of when you put all of these things together, it is discrimination, even if certain individual things are not going to succeed to the point of the judge.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that they're wrong in doing that legally. Like legally, I think the strategy is sound, and I think that these laws in the United States, such as the Equal Pay Act and Title VII, like they exist to prevent these types of discrimination. Now, the way that the law works is that, you take something that is maybe just this general, but you have to prove it. And, that's what they've attempted to do. I don't know that the information that they put out there, the facts that they put in this case, I don't know. I can't say that they don't actually establish that. I mean, clearly a judge says differently, but the strategy is sound from a legal perspective. This is how you have to go about it. And, that's obviously different from talking about the court of public opinion. But, at the end of the day, you see legal victories that don't make any sense. And that is because sometimes when things go to a jury, you are among a jury of your peers. And, they decide things based off of the law as they interpret it. And you get results that will take these kind of pinpoint things and turn them into this general theory of the case, and then you end up getting a result that is not this one, basically.
So on the turf, the judge, let's see here. The exact wording from the judge was, a reasonable trier of fact could not conclude by a preponderance of the evidence that the defendant, U.S. Soccer, intentionally discriminated against the women by subjecting them to turf surfaces more frequently than the men. Meg Linehan of The Athletic pointed out the Federation's argument, quote, that they did not anticipate enough revenue to justify the cost of installing temporary grass for the playing surface. And here is where, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the court of public opinion and the court of law might be different things, and here's why. In the court of public opinion, everybody is screaming at U.S. Soccer. If you lower the ticket prices just a little bit, You'd sell out every game this team plays, no matter the size of the stadium, and you'd put more than enough money in the bank to be able to afford grass to put over the turf. That doesn't get to the judge quite like that, does it?
No, I mean, that's legally, that's not the argument to make. The thing that's so interesting about this turf analysis is that it goes through this burden shifting, analysis where the plaintiffs have to establish it. Then the defendants have to say, great, you established this, but now we're going to show that we had a reason for it that makes sense. And then, where it kind of came down to is that the players couldn't show this pretext of it had nothing to do with revenue. It had everything to do with the fact that as women, we are not worthy of the credence of getting, turf. And so it kind of came down to that. But again, these are all things that I think a reasonable trier of fact could differ. They could put weight to one thing more than the other. And so when I read that, when I saw the judge's kind of final wording on that, I was a little bit perplexed because I think that these are issues of fact that somebody could say, not necessarily. So it was very interesting to read that.
So the U.S. women lost on these points, but they have not lost the case entirely. As you mentioned earlier, there are still some parts of this that are open. Travel, specifically charter flights, and medical and training support, arguments on both of those grounds, as Meg wrote, will go to trial, are allowed to go to trial, whether or not they will.
Yeah.
So the question becomes, the trial as it is didn't really get to the full-blown discovery phase that everybody in the public was hoping that it would, because it would get the four men who were the most involved in all of this over many years, Sunil Gulati, Dan Flynn, Carlos Cordero, and Jay Berhalter, onto a witness stand in front of a jury, not just giving depositions, but really, on the hot seat.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, it's fine. Where do you think it goes from here? Let me ask you to play odds maker for a minute, I guess,
yeah.
Of what the odds are that it gets to a point where there's discovery, even on small stuff, that gets these guys. Again, I use the word guys because they're all four. I know them all. I know all four of them. I know how much power they had, how much they were. Cordero, not so much, but certainly the other three. Cordero, we know why he had to step down, because he wasn't doing his job of oversight. I know how much the other three were directly involved in a lot of this, as do a lot of people. And if it had gotten to discovery, we would have heard a lot of things out of their mouths, I think. What happens now going forward with these small pieces that are left? What are the odds that becomes a full trial?
At this point, technically the discovery phase is over. So the only thing that we'd have going forward is getting those people on the stands. And I cannot see a future that exists where we get any more information, where we get any more kind of inflammatory statements or inside preview or look or insight into their thought process. We don't get that anymore. I mean, at this point, it's done. And even if it goes to trial on these two, the travel conditions and the player and the personnel that's provided, I just don't think that those claims aren't big enough to elicit really any more information out of those people that you're talking about. So I think at this point, we've heard what we've heard from the U.S. Soccer Federation. I don't think we're going to get any more information. We're not going to get any more, we're not going to get somebody on the witness stand being cross-examined and have these headline-making statements being said, just because the rest of the trial is so limited in the scope of what's going to be talked about.
Again, I'm sorry to you and to the listeners for voice, which I know I did. I do get very angry about this stuff, as a lot of people do. If the listeners are waiting for me to get into the politics of the judge, I can't do that, or else I'm going to get in trouble at my real job. So other podcasts will have to get into that. I'm sorry. It is a statement of fact that Judge Klausner was a Republican appointee, I believe, by George W. Bush in the early 2000s. I'll look that up while I'm talking to you.
Yeah, no, I actually people have been kind of putting us a lot of stuff out about that. And, my take on it is, listen, federal judges, they're appointed for life. Whoever they're appointed by, they'll clearly have, opinions. But at the end of the day, they're appointed for life. They don't technically answer to anybody. And we have to remember that the players basically forum shop. They wanted the Central District of California. And one of those reasons is because the Ninth Circuit is such a liberal circuit in terms of their decisions and how they rule on things on appeal. So, conservative, liberal, whatever side you kind of fall on, it's, this judge is appointed for life. He can make rulings based off of what he thinks the law is. And the Ninth Circuit is a very liberal court for any appeals to go to. So I think people just kind of need to remember that.
I'm glad you said all of that. I'm very glad you said all of that. I want to close with this. And again, thanks for coming on. I know you're very busy and very in demand right now for your legal knowledge, and for good reason. As I sit back and think about this and all of the people involved on both sides as if they yelled at him. No, that's not my point. No, as I think about all of the people who are involved in this, who I know personally, who I know professionally, who any of us, whether you or me, Kelsey or Duane or Kevin or the listeners, have come across as public figures, all of it. It certainly seems to me that now this whole matter comes back to where it was in the first place, which is the incumbency upon U.S. Soccer to fix it. And
yeah,
they've always been able to do that. And for people who say to me, blow the thing up, well, there was not one moment where you could feel fulfilled at watching an explosion on TV. But as I said a few minutes ago, the four men who were the most involved over the years and the most responsible for the situation getting to where it is, Sunil Gulati, the former president, Dan Flynn, the former CEO, Jay Berhalter, the former chief commercial officer, and Carlos Cordero, who succeeded Gulati as president. They're all gone. They don't work for U.S. Soccer anymore. They don't have any formal powers within U.S. Soccer anymore. And people are going to say, well, they have informal powers. Yes, okay, they do. Yes, they might get coffee with people every once in a while. I get that. But they're not in the formal hierarchy anymore. And now is the time for Cindy Cohn, the new president, who played for the women's team and was a part of this fight when she played, and for Will Wilson, the new CEO, to, as you said earlier, Kelsey, shut the door, get everybody in the room, and sit down and fix all this stuff. And I hope it happens. I really do.
I think it's the only way forward. And I actually, some people didn't really like U.S. Soccer's statement on it. And I actually thought that their statement on it differed in tone and language than anything they've put out in the past. I actually thought that it was a pretty positive tone, and a tone that reflected, listen, we get that we won legally, but we realize that we have not won in the court of public opinion. So, let's get that done. I really do think that's the only way moving forward, because at the end of the day, they've still spent, a lot of money on these lawsuits. We have to mention, you still have Hope Solo's lawsuit that is pending in the Northern District of California that, that will probably go the same way as this one, because that was stayed until a decision came down in this case. So they've put a lot of money into this. Their reputation is severely damaged. And so in spite of it being a win, and in spite of kind of my initial reaction being like, man, the players really, really lost on this one, I think, the past day or two have kind of changed that a little bit into now this might be the only position or the only place where both sides are in the position to actually have an outcome that is fair and reflective of a path going forward.
Well, Kelsey, thanks so much for coming on. I know, as I said, you've been busy with this, with your uncle, and condolences on that. I should have said that at the top of the show.
Thank you.
I would like to have you on again at some point, but I also would like to not have all this legal drama to have to deal with.
I'm going to come on to talk about bagels next time.
Yes, let's do that. Kelsey, thanks again for coming on.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Welcome back. Jonathan Tannenwald here in Philadelphia. Duane Rollins in Toronto. You don't get the outtakes version of the show in which we just completely botched the coming back from the break. Duane, what'd you make of all that?
Look, it's not satisfying for anyone. I can't imagine the outcome of what would have occurred. If you've read the filing, the summary judgment from the judge, and you do so with a dispassionate mind, it is easy to see how they came to the conclusions that they did. However, if you live in the real world, it is also easy to see how people are so angry and frustrated and not understanding how this has not gone in the favor of the players, because as many people have said, the court of public opinion is quite strongly ruled in favor of the women a long time ago. And it's because of 1,000 little microaggressions over the years that add up to what seems to be an obvious case of discrimination. But as we see in this legal finding from a conservative judge, but still a legal finding that is based in some numbers that are hard to dispute and were not disputed by the lawyers, at least yet. It is easy to see how they came to that, but it is very difficult to come away with this feeling good, whether or not you supported the women or not in this. And I imagine most of our listeners did, but even if you were on the side of the Federation, which I don't know who is, but if you were, you probably still aren't feeling happy with this, which brings us back to, where is the future lie? What is the next move? Is it more fight, or is it finally time for compromise? Because to me, there's no victory if you move forward from here with continuing to fight this cause. I do not see a legal way out. The lawyers that I have talked to are pretty unanimous that maybe they might be, there might be some room for wiggle room here and there, but by and large, the end result is going to be the same. To me, and it's easy for me to say, I appreciate, but to me, the solution now is to get to a table and to hold out things like Joe Biden immediately supporting them regardless of a legal judgment, to hold out the angry responses on Twitter and on Facebook and all the places where WOSO fans gather, and to say, look, these are heroes and you're not going to win if you just say, look, we won legally, take what we give us. You need to find the compromise now. They need to find a solution that I don't know if anyone can ever be all satisfied, but that satisfies the most amount of people now, Jonathan.
How much does it resonate up there? I'm curious. And how much would it resonate if, and it's a big if the men and the women down here do agree to joint bargaining? Not that they both get paid the same, they would each have their terms, but if they actually did go to the table together and make a deal, because the U.S. Women's CBA expires at the end of next year, and the men currently don't have one at all. So if there was an interest in joint bargaining, look, I'd like to think that maybe everybody could say, look, we're just going to tear up the Women's CBA and do all this. If that were to happen, and it may be far-fetched, but if it was to happen, how much, Duane, would it resonate up there?
Not to the global extent that it does in the United States, clearly, where these women have become household names, but certainly within the soccer community of Canada, it resonates a great deal. It has followed a great deal. The U.S. women's national team has followed a great deal within soccer communities up here, for rivalry reasons in some cases, but also there are a lot of Canadians that I think, particularly on the women's side of the game, that do don't dislike the team, that do want them to succeed and do look at their battle as being a battle for all of women's soccer, whether it be in Canada, the United States, or anywhere around the world. And I do think that there are people within the women's game that are looking quite closely at this and also looking at the CSA and wondering what the next move here is. I mean, you have a situation where the Canadian Federation, the CSA, is spending a lot of time and effort and money to prop up the men's league, Canadian Premier League, and there is no female plan yet. There's going to be increasing pressure to do that. There already is pressure from, sort of the soccer bubble, but that's going to continue to resonate out. Had there been a successful outcome for the women in this case, I think you would have seen Canadians that would have used that and held that up as, why aren't we doing more for our women's program here? That hasn't reached a critical mass yet in Canada, but certainly this case could have propelled that forward. And I believe that the loss of the women on Friday with the summary judgment was a bit of a blow for anyone who wanted to or was hoping that you would be able to use that and hold that up to put forward issues here as well. As much as Canadians don't like to hear this, we do parrot a lot of what happens in the United States after it happens down there. I mean, that's the history of being the little brother and the big brother scenario. We're just smaller. But, that's my answer. It is affecting, but maybe not to the critical mass that it is in the United States.
I'm out of things to say, I feel like. I just, what's left?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Look, obviously everyone wants them to get what they're worth, and hopefully I from an outside perspective, I actually do have a little bit more hope from what I see with the new leadership at the USSF. I mean, it's very new, but what I'm seeing so far gives me a little bit more hope, I think, than Americans that are right involved in it day to day have, because I understand it's the same as up here, right? Like, if you're outside it a little bit, you can have less of a cynical view because you could sort of take statements at a closer to face value. So I guess maybe if I want to end it positively, that's what I would say. I think there is an understanding from the people I'm seeing within U.S. soccer that there needs to be a solution that is far more on the women's side of this argument, if you want to put it in those kind of terms, than it is on the pure numbers side. The numbers do add up favorably for the USSF, but I think there's an understanding that that's a losing cause for them, for the USSF in general. It's a losing cause for the game as a whole. And there is, I think you mentioned in the interview, how having a judgment come down for $60 million or whatever it was would have put everyone in a difficult situation. It would have been a position of conflict continuing forward. It would have put the future of the programs in jeopardy. We've already seen, the issues on the men's side of the game are well known. We don't need to repeat them on this show. I think there's a danger, as much as the women's program in the United States is so powerful, that if you continue to fight in these ways and if you take holes out of the youth programs and stop investing in development and don't make improvements across the board on the development side of the game in the United States, there will come a time when the dominance that the women have enjoyed so much and have caused so much joy for so many people for so long will start to slide away. Not everything is forever, right? So hopefully this will allow saner, more reasonable minds to get together and try and protect the future of the game, as well as reward the current players for what they have done to grow the game and inspire so many people around the United States and around the world.
I have to, as we record this on Sunday, I have to go do my real job for a while. So we'll call it there and see what happens. Duane, as you like to do, take us out.
All right. Thanks once again for everyone listening. If you enjoy this show, we have soccer coverage across the board on the Sports Podcasting Network. You can listen to our daily show, Soccer Today, 11 a.m. Eastern Time, Monday to Friday on the Sports Podcasting Network, SPM Soccer Today on the Twitters. I'm at 24th Minute, at The Goalkeeper. Thanks for listening.